The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Maplewood Lane, a quiet suburban neighborhood where life moved at its own unhurried pace. Officer Greg Thompson sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. He had been assigned to this area for years and prided himself on knowing every resident by name, or so he thought. To him, Maplewood was as peaceful as it got, but today felt different. Something about the crisp autumn air seemed off. Greg wasn't known for being particularly friendly. His reputation around town leaned more toward sternness than warmth, though some people respected his no-nonsense approach. Others whispered behind closed doors about how quick he was to judge based on appearances. Those whispers rarely reached Greg's ears, and if they did, he dismissed them with a shrug. After all, he believed rules were rules, and everyone should follow them without question. As he drove down the street, his attention caught on a man walking briskly along the sidewalk. The man wore a dark hoodie pulled over his head, hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. It was Marcus Johnson, a local handyman who often worked late fixing appliances or doing odd jobs for neighbors. Marcus didn't notice the patrol car, slowing beside him. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the day's challenges and thinking about dinner waiting at home. Officer Thompson rolled down his window. "Hey," he called out sharply. "You there?" Marcus stopped mid-stride, startled. When he turned, his expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "Yes?" he asked cautiously. "Do you know me?" Greg demanded, his tone brusque. Marcus hesitated, unsure what the officer meant. I don't think so." "You walked right past my car without even acknowledging me," Greg continued, leaning slightly out of the window. "Not even a nod or a hello, that's disrespectful." Marcus blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. "I didn't see you. I've just had a long day." "Didn't see me?" Greg interrupted, his voice rising. "How could you not? My car's parked right here. You can't ignore an officer of the law like that." A tense silence settled between them. Marcus glanced around, noticing a few neighbors peeking through their curtains. He swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he explained. "I'm just heading home. No harm done, right?" But Greg wasn't satisfied. In his mind, this wasn't just about a missed greeting. It was about respect, authority, and control. And Marcus, standing there in his hoodie, represented everything Greg disliked yet couldn't quite articulate. Without another word, Greg stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Show me your ID," Greg ordered, his hand resting conspicuously on the holster of his gun. Marcus froze, panic creeping into his chest. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped by police under questionable circumstances, but each encounter left him feeling smaller, angrier, and more powerless. Still, he complied, pulling his wallet from his pocket and handing over his driver's license. Greg studied the card, squinting at the photo before looking back at Marcus. "Everything checks out," he muttered reluctantly. But instead of letting Marcus go, he added, "Still, I need to make sure you're not up to something. Get in the car." "For what?" Marcus asked, incredulous. "I haven't done anything." "Wrong." "That's for me to decide," Greg replied coldly, opening the back door of the patrol car. Reluctantly, Marcus climbed inside, his heart pounding. As the door slammed shut behind him, he stared out the window, watching the world blur past. What started as an ordinary evening had suddenly spiraled into something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. Little did either of them know, this moment would set off a chain reaction neither could have anticipated. The interior of the patrol car felt suffocating to Marcus. The air was stale, tinged with the faint smell of old leather and cleaning products. He sat stiffly on the cold vinyl seat, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. Outside, the familiar streets of Maplewood blurred as Officer Greg Thompson drove them toward the station. Every bump in the road jolted Marcus back to reality, reminding him that this wasn't just another bad dream. It was happening. Greg remained silent behind the wheel, His jaw clenched as he navigated the quiet roads. His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel, though whether from anger or tension it was hard to tell. For Marcus, the silence was deafening. Each passing second stretched longer than the last, filling the space between them with unspoken accusations and mounting dread. "Can you at least tell me why I'm here?" Marcus finally asked, breaking the heavy quiet. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the anxiety bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "You'll find out soon enough," Greg replied curtly without taking his eyes off the road. His tone left no room for further questions. Marcus sank deeper into the seat, frustration simmering inside him. He replayed the events leading up to this moment over and over in his mind, walking home after a long day's work, lost in thought, not noticing the officer's car. How could something so trivial escalate like this? It didn't make sense. Yet deep down, Marcus knew it wasn't really about a missed greeting. This had happened before, not always with arrests, but with stares, comments, assumptions, all rooted in prejudice he couldn't escape. As they pulled into the police station parking lot, Marcus caught sight of himself in the side mirror. His reflection looked tired, defeated even. He hated feeling powerless, but experience had taught him that arguing wouldn't help. Instead, he resolved to stay calm and cooperate fully, hoping this ordeal would end quickly. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sterile walls. A few officers glanced up briefly as Greg led Marcus to a small interrogation room. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing Marcus inside a cramped space dominated by a metal table and 2 chairs. Greg gestured for him to sit while he took the chair opposite, pulling out a notepad and pen. "So," Greg began, leaning forward slightly, "let's start with your name." "Marcus Johnson," Marcus answered evenly, meeting the officer's gaze despite the knot forming in his stomach. "You already saw my ID." "I know what I saw," Greg shot back, tapping the pen against the notepad. "But IDs can be forged. People lie all the time." Marcus bit back a retort, reminding himself to stay composed. "What do you want to know?" Greg flipped open the notepad and started asking routine questions. Where Marcus lived, where he worked, what he'd been doing earlier that day. Marcus answered honestly, keeping his responses concise and polite. Still, each question felt like another layer of scrutiny, another reminder that he was being judged not just by his words, but by the color of his skin. After several minutes, Greg paused, setting the pen down and studying Marcus intently. "You seem awfully calm for someone in your position," he remarked, his tone laced with suspicion. "I'm calm because I haven't done anything wrong," Marcus replied firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. "If there's a problem, I'd like to resolve it so I can go home." Greg leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "We'll see about that." At that moment, a young officer knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. "Sir, there's a call for you. Urgent." Greg frowned but stood up, leaving Marcus alone in the room. As the door closed behind him, Marcus exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. He glanced around the barren room, searching for answers that weren't there. What was going on? Why had Greg singled him out like this? Minutes ticked by agonizingly, slowly until the door opened again. But instead of Greg returning, a different figure entered, a woman with kind eyes and an empathetic smile. She introduced herself as Detective Laura Hayes, explaining that she'd been monitoring the situation closely. Something about her demeanor put Marcus at ease, though he remained cautious. "I understand this has been stressful for you," Laura said gently, sitting across from him. "I'd like to hear your side of things." For the first time since the encounter began, Marcus felt heard. As he recounted the events, Laura listened intently, nodding occasionally. Unbeknownst to both of them, this conversation would set the stage for revelations neither expected, and change far more than just one man's fate. Detective Laura Hayes leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful as Marcus finished recounting his story. Her pen hovered over her notepad, jotting down key details while she processed what he'd said. Unlike Greg's brusque demeanor, Laura radiated calmness and professionalism, making the sterile interrogation room feel marginally less oppressive. "So let me get this straight," Laura began, her voice measured but warm. "You were walking home after work, minding your own business, when Officer Thompson stopped you because you didn't acknowledge him?" Marcus nodded, his shoulders sagging with a mix of exhaustion and relief. It felt good to finally have someone listen without jumping to conclusions. "Exactly, I didn't even see him until he called out to me, and then, well, here we are." Laura tapped her pen lightly against the table, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had been observing Greg's behavior for weeks now, noting patterns that troubled her deeply. His tendency to escalate minor incidents into something far more serious wasn't new, but targeting individuals based on implicit biases, that was crossing a line. "Thank you for sharing your side," she said sincerely, offering Marcus a small smile. "I'll do my best to ensure this situation is resolved fairly." Before Marcus could respond, the door swung open and Greg strode back in, his face flushed with irritation. He glanced between Laura and Marcus, clearly unimpressed by the interruption. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "I'm gathering additional information," Laura replied smoothly, standing up to meet his gaze. "Standard procedure when discrepancies arise." Greg narrowed his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he turned to Marcus, his jaw tightening. "We're not done yet." Laura stepped closer to Greg, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "This doesn't look good, Greg. You pulled him in over a missed greeting? People are watching." "If word gets out, I followed protocol," Greg snapped, though his confidence wavered under Laura's steady glare. "He was uncooperative. I had every right to bring him in." Laura sighed, shaking her head slightly. "Let's table this for now. We need to handle this carefully, for everyone's sake." Reluctantly, Greg agreed, stepping aside as Laura gestured for Marcus to follow her out of the room. As they walked through the station, whispers rippled among the officers. Some looked sympathetic, others avoided eye contact altogether. Marcus kept his head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Once outside, Laura turned, to him her expression softening further. "You're free to go for now, but I'll need you to stay available in case we have follow-up questions." Marcus hesitated, unsure whether to trust her completely. Still, he nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Detective, I really appreciate it." As Marcus walked away, Laura watched him disappear into the night, her thoughts swirling. This incident wasn't isolated. It was symptomatic of larger issues within the department, and if left unchecked, those issues would continue eroding trust between law enforcement and the community. Back inside, Greg paced angrily near his desk, replaying the events in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd done nothing wrong, that enforcing respect was part of his job. Yet doubt lingered at the edges of his certainty. Was he too harsh? Did he misread the situation? His internal conflict deepened when Captain Reynolds approached, his face grim. "We've got a problem," the captain stated bluntly. "Word spreading about tonight, someone recorded part of your interaction with Mr. Johnson." Greg froze, his heart sinking. "Recorded? Who?" "A neighbor," Captain Reynolds explained. "They posted it online and it's already gaining traction. We need damage control. Fast." Greg's frustration boiled over. "This is ridiculous. All I did was enforce the rules." Captain Reynolds held up a hand, silencing him. "It doesn't matter what you think you did. What matters is how it's perceived. Public perception can make or break us, Greg. You know that." The weight of the captain's words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he realized the gravity of his actions and the potential consequences. Meanwhile, online discussions about the incident grew louder, drawing attention from local activists, journalists, and even national media outlets. Unbeknownst to anyone, however, the real turning point was still to come. A single act of courage from an unexpected source would soon challenge everything Greg believed and force the entire town to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, accountability, and humanity. By morning, the video of Greg's interaction with Marcus had gone viral. The clip, shaky but clear enough to capture the tense exchange, showed Greg confronting Marcus on the sidewalk and then leading him to the patrol car. While the footage didn't include sound, the visual narrative spoke volumes. Social media erupted with outrage, hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and "Accountability" now trending across platforms. Comments ranged from calls for Greg's immediate suspension to broader discussions about systemic bias in law enforcement. In Maplewood, the small-town charm that residents prided themselves on seemed to crack under the weight of scrutiny. Neighbors, who once greeted each other warmly, now exchanged uneasy glances. Some defended Greg, insisting he was just doing his job, while others admitted they'd witnessed similar incidents before but never spoke up. The divide between these perspectives grew wider by the hour. Greg arrived at the station early, hoping to avoid the storm brewing outside. But as soon as he stepped through the doors, he felt the atmosphere shift. Officers avoided eye contact or muttered disapproving comments under their breath. Even Captain Reynolds looked visibly stressed, pacing near his office with a phone pressed to his ear. "Greg," the captain called out, motioning him over. "We've got reporters camped outside. They're demanding answers." Greg clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "What do they want me to say? That I'm sorry for enforcing the law?" Captain Reynolds sighed heavily. "This isn't about what you think happened. It's about perception. People see this as another example of racial profiling, whether you intended it that way or not." "I wasn't profiling anyone," Greg shot back, his voice rising. "He ignored me. That's disrespectful." "Intent doesn't matter right now," the captain replied firmly. "What matters is how this looks. You need to issue a statement, something calm and measured to address the public concern." Greg opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself. He knew arguing wouldn't help. Reluctantly, he agreed to draft a statement, though every word felt like swallowing bitter medicine. Meanwhile, Marcus woke up to a flood of notifications on his phone. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers had reached out, expressing support and solidarity. Local activists invited him to speak at an upcoming town hall meeting about police accountability. At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but something inside him stirred. Maybe this was his chance to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others who felt powerless against injustice. Later that day, Detective Laura Hayes visited Marcus at home. She carried a folder filled with notes and updates about the investigation into Greg's actions. Sitting across from Marcus in his modest living room, she explained the steps being taken to ensure accountability. "We're reviewing all available evidence," Laura said earnestly, "and we're committed to transparency. This kind of behavior can't be ignored." Marcus nodded, appreciating her sincerity. "I don't want revenge," he admitted quietly. "I just want change. Real change." Laura smiled faintly. "That starts with people like you willing to stand up. We'll get there." As news of the town hall spread, tensions in Maplewood reached a boiling point. Flyers appeared around town, urging residents to attend and have their voices heard. Some supported Marcus, while others rallied behind Greg, accusing critics of exaggerating the incident. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the community's values and reveal cracks hidden beneath its surface. On the evening of the town hall, the local high school auditorium buzzed with energy. Rows of chairs filled quickly as people packed in, eager to witness history unfold. Among the crowd sat an unlikely figure, Sarah Thompson, Greg's teenage daughter. Quietly, she slipped into a seat near the back, clutching her phone tightly. No one noticed her arrival, or realized the role she would soon play in reshaping the narrative. Little did anyone know, her decision to attend would ignite a chain reaction neither side could have predicted. The high school auditorium was alive, with murmurs as the clock ticked closer to the start of the town hall meeting. The air felt heavy, charged with emotion, anger, fear, hope, and defiance mingling in equal measure. Residents of Maplewood sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces reflecting a spectrum of opinions. On stage, a panel of speakers had been arranged, including local activists, city officials, and representatives from the police department. Marcus sat nervously at one end of the table. his hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't expected this kind of attention when he agreed to speak, but now that the moment was here, he resolved to stay calm and focused. As the moderator opened the floor for discussion, the room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some attendees demanded accountability for Greg's actions, while others defended him fiercely, insisting he was being unfairly targeted. Tempers flared, and it took several minutes for the moderator to restore order. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him as he stood up slowly, gripping the edges of the podium for support. Taking a deep breath, he began to share his story, not just about the encounter with Greg, but about what it meant to live under constant scrutiny because of the color of his skin. His words were measured yet powerful, painting a vivid picture of frustration, exhaustion, and resilience. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the weight of his emotions. "I'm asking for understanding, for change. No one should have to feel afraid walking home simply because of who they are." His speech struck a chord with many in the audience, earning applause and nods of agreement, but not everyone was moved. A man seated near the front, a longtime supporter of Greg, stood abruptly, pointing a finger at Marcus. "You're making this about race when it isn't," the man shouted. Officer Thompson was enforcing respect, plain and simple. The muck comment ignited another round of heated debate, threatening to derail the meeting entirely. Amid the chaos, a young voice cut through the noise. "That's not true." All heads turned toward the back of the room where Sarah Thompson stood, her cheeks flushed but her expression determined. She stepped forward hesitantly, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Silence fell over the crowd as she made her way to the front. "My dad." "He didn't stop Mr. Johnson because of respect," Sarah began, her voice trembling but clear. "He stopped him because of how he looked. I've heard him talk before, at home, at family gatherings. He says things I used to ignore because I didn't want to believe them, but now I can't." Sarah paused, tears welling in her eyes. "This isn't just about one bad decision, it's about patterns, and if we don't face those patterns honestly, nothing will ever change." Her confession sent shockwaves through the room. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by murmurs of disbelief and admiration. Even Marcus seemed taken aback, watching Sarah with a mix of awe and gratitude. Greg, seated among the police representatives on stage, went pale. His daughter's betrayal cut deeper than any criticism from strangers. For the first time, cracks appeared in his stoic facade, revealing the turmoil beneath. Captain Reynolds leaned over to whisper urgently in Greg's ear, "We need to address this, now." But Greg couldn't move. He sat frozen, grappling with the realization that his actions and attitudes had consequences far beyond what he'd imagined. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to her seat, shaking but resolute. Her courage had shifted the narrative, forcing Maplewood to confront uncomfortable truths it could no longer ignore. As the meeting continued, the conversation took on a new tone, one of introspection and accountability. Yet the question remained, would this moment lead to real change, or would the momentum fade as quickly as it had risen? Only time would tell. The days following the town hall meeting were unlike anything Maplewood had ever experienced. Conversations that had long been whispered behind closed doors were now out in the open, raw and unfiltered. Neighbors who once avoided discussing sensitive topics found themselves debating passionately over coffee or at grocery store checkout lines. For some, Sarah's courageous testimony served as a wake-up call. For others, it deepened existing divisions. But one thing was certain, the quiet suburban town would never be the same. Greg struggled to process everything that had happened. His reputation, once untouchable in his own eyes, lay in tatters. At home, tension simmered between him and Sarah, who refused to back down despite her father's attempts to dismiss her words as youthful naivety. "You can't ignore this, Dad," she told him firmly one evening, standing in the kitchen with tears streaming down her face. "What you did wasn't okay, and pretending it didn't happen won't fix anything." Her words stung, but they also planted a seed of doubt in Greg's mind. He began to replay moments from his career, not just the incident with Marcus, but countless interactions where his biases may have influenced his decisions. Was he truly upholding justice? Or had he been perpetuating harm under the guise of authority? The questions haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his conscience. At work, the atmosphere was equally tense. Captain Reynolds called an emergency meeting with the department to address the fallout. "This isn't just about Officer Thompson," he emphasized, pacing in front of the assembled officers. "It's about us, all of us, looking inward and asking hard questions. Are we serving this community fairly, or are we letting personal prejudices dictate our actions?" Some officers bristled at the implication, while others nodded thoughtfully. Laura Hayes took the opportunity to propose mandatory bias training sessions and community outreach programs aimed at rebuilding trust. Though initially met with skepticism, her ideas gained traction as more officers recognized the need for change. Meanwhile, Marcus became an unexpected symbol of hope for many residents. Invitations poured in for speaking engagements, interviews, and panel discussions. While he appreciated the support, he remained grounded, focusing on tangible ways to drive progress. Together with local activists, he helped organize workshops designed to foster dialogue between law enforcement and marginalized communities. These efforts weren't without challenges. Some participants arrived defensive or unwilling to listen, but small victories kept them going. One such victory came when Greg reluctantly attended one of these workshops. Sitting stiffly in a circle of chairs, surrounded by people whose lives he'd impacted directly or indirectly, he felt exposed and vulnerable. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can fix what I've done," he admitted, "but I want to try." His honesty surprised even himself, and earned nods of encouragement from those around him. It was a start, however imperfect. As weeks turned into months, signs of healing began to emerge. A mural dedicated to unity appeared on a downtown wall, painted collaboratively by volunteers from all walks of life. Community events drew larger crowds than ever before, fostering connections that transcended differences. Even Greg, though still grappling with guilt and self-doubt, started making amends in small but meaningful ways, like apologizing personally to Marcus during a chance encounter at the park. "I'm sorry," Greg said simply, extending a hand. "For everything." Marcus studied him for a moment before shaking his hand firmly. "Apology accepted. Now let's keep moving forward." Though scars remained, Maplewood proved that growth often begins with discomfort. But as the town learned, true redemption required more than apologies. It demanded action, accountability, an unwavering commitment to change. And somewhere along the way, hope began to bloom again. Months had passed since the town hall meeting, and Maplewood was slowly transforming. The once divided community now bore signs of unity, though the journey toward healing was far from over. Change didn't happen overnight. It came in small, deliberate steps, like seeds planted in fertile soil. Some took root quickly, others required patience and care. But for the first time in years, there was a shared sense of purpose among residents, a collective determination to build something stronger than what had come before. Greg's transformation became one of the most talked about stories in town, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. He continued attending workshops and counseling sessions, working tirelessly to confront his biases and understand their impact. It wasn't easy. There were days when old habits resurfaced, moments when he questioned whether he deserved forgiveness. But every apology he offered, every effort he made to listen rather than judge, chipped away at the walls he'd built around himself. One afternoon, as Greg walked through the park, he noticed a group of kids playing basketball near the court, where Marcus often coached local youth. Hesitant but curious, Greg approached them. "Mind if I join?" he asked, gesturing toward the game. The kids exchanged glances, surprised by the request, but eventually nodded. For the next hour, laughter filled the air as Greg played alongside them, his stern demeanor replaced by genuine smiles. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes about how far he'd come. Marcus, watching from a distance, couldn't help but smile. He'd seen Greg's efforts firsthand, how he volunteered at community events, how he reached out to neighbors he'd previously ignored. While Marcus knew trust couldn't be rebuilt instantly, he respected Greg's willingness to try. Progress isn't always loud, Marcus told Laura during one of their regular check-ins. Sometimes it's quiet, and that's okay. Laura nodded, her own faith in humanity renewed by the changes she'd witnessed. The police department had implemented several reforms inspired by her initial proposals, including ongoing bias training and increased transparency in disciplinary actions. Officers began patrolling on foot more often, engaging with residents in meaningful ways. Slowly but surely, perceptions shifted, not completely, but enough to spark hope. Sarah, too, found her voice growing stronger. Encouraged by the support she received after speaking at the town hall, she started a youth-led initiative called Maplewood Listens, aimed at fostering open dialogue between generations. Her father attended one of the meetings, sitting quietly in the back as teenagers shared their experiences and dreams for the future. When Sarah caught him wiping away a tear, she felt a pang of pride and relief. They still had work to do, but they were moving forward together. The town itself reflected this progress. The mural painted months earlier remained a vibrant centerpiece, its colors bright against the backdrop of Maplewood streets. Community gardens flourished, tended by volunteers from all backgrounds. Even the annual Fall Festival drew record attendance, with neighbors sharing food, music, and laughter under twinkling string lights. But perhaps the most profound change was internal, the shift in mindset. People began to see each other not as stereotypes or labels, but as individuals with stories worth hearing. Conversations grew deeper, connections stronger. Mistakes were acknowledged, apologies given, and bridges rebuilt. As winter approached, Marcus stood on his porch one evening, gazing at the quiet neighborhood bathed in soft moonlight. He thought about everything that had transpired, the pain, the courage, the resilience, and allowed himself a moment of gratitude. Maplewood wasn't perfect, but it was learning. And sometimes, that was enough. In the distance, Greg walked past, nodding respectfully as their eyes met. Neither said a word, but the acknowledgement carried weight, a silent promise to keep striving, to keep building, to keep believing. Because even in imperfection, there was hope. And in hope, there was the possibility of a brighter tomorrow,